to help us understand the concept a little bit better of John and Mina. I was going to put Mina and Kyrillos, but that was too Coptic, so I thought I'd put John. And then at the end, supporting someone with mental illness. Now, because a lot of this stuff is going to be statistics and understanding mental health, there isn't too much of a spiritual component to it. There will be some, but not much. So what I ask is that if you have any questions at the end of the spiritual side of this sort of stuff, please do ask them. I love questions. For those who have been to my talks before, you'll know that I really enjoy questions at the end. So write them down and we'll cover any questions you might have at the end. Especially if you think there's something I didn't cover, raise it and we'll talk about it. Okay. Okay. So what is mental health? So a definition that sort of hits a nail on the head is a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to her or his community. So if you were going to say it from a Christian perspective, it would be a human being who's been healed to a certain extent by the grace of God, has progressed somewhat in a state of Christ-likeness, becoming like our Lord, and therefore is a productive and fruitful member of the community. But that is more of a definition widely held, generally speaking, and outside the church as well. So mental illness in Australia. So 1 in 5 Australians, and that includes obviously all of us, we consider Australians, aged between 16 and 85 experience a mental illness in any year. 20%. That's actually 5 million people. Yeah. The most common mental illnesses are depression, anxiety, and some substance use disorders. So substance use meaning drug and alcohol use. So these 3 types of mental illness often occur in combination. For example, a person with anxiety disorder could also develop depression, or a person with depression might misuse alcohol or other drugs in an effort to self-medicate. Of the 20% of Australians with a mental illness in any one year, 11.5% have only one of the disorders, and 8.5% have 2 or more disorders, meaning they could have anxiety and depression or anxiety and substance use disorders. And when you look at it, 45% of Australians will experience a mental illness in their lifetime. So almost half the population will actually experience some sort of mental illness during their lifetime. So you can understand the need as a community for us to understand this concept of mental health on a deeper level, just to be able not only to educate ourselves, help ourselves, but also help our brothers and sisters who might be suffering in this way. So the onset of mental illness is typically around mid to late adolescence. So that means from 18 to 24 years old. So that's generally when it starts to manifest itself. It doesn't mean that it can't start younger than that. It doesn't mean it can't start older than that. But that's generally when it starts to manifest itself. And Australian youth have the highest prevalence of mental illness in any other age group. So that's huge. So out of all the age groups, 18 to 20 prevalence. So data from the 2014 Mission Australia's youth survey showed that around 1 in 5 young people, so that's 21.2%, 1 in 5 of young people between 15 and 19 years old, met the criteria for a probable serious mental illness. So again, that's huge when you think about it. So 1 in 5 people from 15 to 19 years old tick the box for having a serious mental health illness. And again, the most common ones, if we look at it by a percentage, are depression with 14%, anxiety and depression, at 14%, and substance use disorders at 5%. So 14 for anxiety, 6 for depression, and 5 for substance use, Sadly, only 54% of people with mental illness, only 46 actually access treatment. 54% of people with mental illness do not access any treatment. So this is actually worsened by delayed treatment due to serious problems in detection and accurate diagnosis. So the very fact that it's hard to detect this sort of thing and have an accurate diagnosis worsens the treatment, delays it in taking place. What we've actually found is access to treatment is essential because 75% of people that enter into public mental health improve notably. So those who actually gain treatment, 3 out of 4 will actually improve. Yeah, so it shows you that the necessity of people entering into treatment. In particular, primary mental health care services are central in addressing signs of mental illness in children and young people, with appropriate treatment providing both immediate and long-term positive outcomes. So it shows you the necessity of when someone's actually struggling with any sort of mental health to seek help. Because those who seek help and actually access services, 3 out of 4 will improve notably. So they'll start to overcome their issues, whether it's anxiety, depression, or whatever it might be. 6 Australians die from suicide every day. So when you think of that, that's huge, right? Like 6 people die of suicide every day. A further 30 people will attempt to take their own life daily. While suicide accounts for only a relatively small portion of all deaths in Australia, so it's 1.6 deaths of Australia are by suicide, it does account for a greater proportion of deaths from all causes within a specific age group. So what I mean by that is in certain age groups, the leading cause of death, or maybe the second leading cause of death, is actually suicide, which is very sad. So an example of that is that suicide is the leading cause of death for people in Australia between 25 and 44. More than cancer, more than anything else, suicide is the leading cause of death. The second leading cause of death for people between 15 and 24. So Australians are actually more likely to die by suicide than skin cancer. Very sad. Men are actually at greater risk of suicide, and they're also the least likely to seek help. You know, toughen up. It's sort of the stereotype that men are strong, and therefore it's a weakness to seek help, and therefore they suffer with their mental health alone, and that's a consequence of someone having severe mental health for a long time without support, is they generally can go down that path, which is very sad. In 2011, men accounted for over 3/4 of deaths from suicide, so 76%. However, an estimated 72% of males don't seek help for mental disorders. So you can see a very close correlation between the amount of males that actually commit suicide and the percentage of males that don't seek help for mental health issues. Another reason to raise awareness in our communities, and hopefully people can seek help when they need it. Other groups that are at greater risk include Indigenous Australians. They experience an overall rate of suicide that's more than double of non-Indigenous Australians. The LGBTIQ communities also experience a rate of attempted suicide that's 4 times higher than those identifying as straight, people in rural and remote areas, and children. Attempted suicide is also important. It's estimated that in Australia about 65,300 people attempt suicide each year, the majority being women. The most significant factor contributing to a completed suicide is a previous attempt, with 1 in 6 attempts followed by another over the next year. So most attempts are by women. The most successful attempts are by men. That doesn't, I think the only reason for that is that men might have, I wouldn't say bravery, but they're more willing to take higher risks in the attempt of suicide compared to women who may not, for example, use guns and so on. It's recognized that the number of suicides and attempted suicide is likely to be underreported as well, and one of the main reasons for the underreporting is determining people's intentions and reporting problems and the stigma around suicide and self-harm. So the statistics could actually be higher. We'll now have a look at depression and anxiety. So depression. Now, if I was to ask a question about what does our community believe causes depression, and these are really like, general sort of things, but some people might think that some of the things that cause depression are not attending church enough, not having an active spiritual life. So you might hear someone from church has depression, you might say, oh, they're not praying enough, or they're not fasting, maybe not reading the Bible enough, not believing in God, being of a non-Christian religion maybe makes more people likely to depression, and perhaps other things. But if we're actually looking at, so to rewind a bit, so while all these things might be able to contribute to negative mental health, because we are created in the image and likeness of God and find healing and meaning through our relationship with God, the truth is that there are other significant causes of mental health that we need to be aware of. So it's not just this stuff. This stuff might contribute a little bit, but there's other significant causes. So depression is more than just a low mood. So it doesn't mean that you're feeling a little bit sad. It's a serious condition. It actually affects a person's physical and mental health. All of us can feel sad from time to time. We could be moody or low, but some people experience these feelings of sadness, moodiness, or lowness, feeling low, for really intensely for long periods of time. So it could be for weeks, could be for months, or even years, sometimes without any apparent reason. Having said that, depression usually results from a combination of recent events and other long-term or personal factors, rather than one immediate issue or event. So what that's saying there is that generally speaking, there's a lot of things that would be happening in someone's life or have happened in someone's life that have contributed to that person being in a place where they're now experiencing depression. Some examples are family history. So depression can run in families, and some people will be at an increased genetic risk. However, having a parent or close relative with depression doesn't mean that someone's automatically going to have depression. Life circumstances and personal factors are still likely to have an important influence. So just because someone's mum and dad has depression doesn't mean they're going to have it. Obviously, they have their own life and other factors that could be very positive in their life and therefore be protective factors from them having depression. But they could be more likely to have it genetically because of it running in the family. Personality, so some people might be more at risk of depression because of their personality, particularly if a person has a tendency to worry a lot, have low self-esteem, perfectionists, or are really sensitive to criticism, or they're very self-critical and negative. So people that might have those particular character traits might be more likely to actually having depression. They're at higher risk. Serious medical illness, so the stress and worry of coping with a serious illness can lead to depression. For example, if someone has cancer and they know that the prognosis is not good, then that can lead to depression, as an example. Drug and alcohol use. So drug and alcohol use can both lead to and result from depression. So a lot of people with depression also have drug and alcohol problems. Over 500,000 Australians will experience depression and a substance use disorder at the same time at some point in their lives. That's massive when you think about that. So depression is not simply the result of a chemical imbalance. There has been a lot of research in this complex area, and there's still a lot that we don't know. But it's not simply the result of a chemical imbalance. For example, because we have too much or don't have enough of a particular brain chemical. It's far more complicated than that, and there are multiple causes of major depression. Factors such as I mentioned, genetic vulnerability, severe life stresses, substances that someone might take, whether that's medications or drugs, and medical conditions can affect the way a person's brain is able to regulate their mood. So anxiety, it's more than just feeling stressed or worried. While stress and anxious feelings are a common response to a situation where we feel under pressure, they normally pass. So you might have a HSC exam or something like that, or a uni exam, and you feel a little bit stressed. But once you've attended that exam, it's passed. So everyone can feel anxious from time to time. It's when these feelings actually don't go away and happen without any particular reason, or a person can't figure out why it's going on, making it really hard for them to cope in day-to-day life, that it could be a sign of an anxiety condition. It's one of the most common mental health conditions, with 1 in 4 people experiencing anxiety at some stage. So that's huge if you think about it. It's 1 in 3 women and 1 in 5 men, and they'll experience this at some stage in their life. In a 12-month period, over 2 million Australians experience anxiety. So that's 10% of the population. It's massive when you think about it again. There's a lot of ways to help manage anxiety, and the sooner that people with anxiety seek support, the more likely they are able to recover. As I said, normal anxiety tends to be time limited. It's connected with a stressful situation or event, like a job interview or an exam or something like that. So the type of anxiety experienced by people with an anxiety condition, it's more frequent and persistent. It's not always connected to an obvious challenge, and it definitely impacts on their quality of life and their day-to-day functioning. So some of the symptoms, Each anxiety condition has its own unique features, but these are some that might be general across the board. So physical, it could be panic attacks, hot and cold flushes, racing heart, tightening of the chest, quick breathing, restlessness, or feeling tense, being wound up and edgy. So they're the physical symptoms. Psychological symptoms, excessive fear, worry, catastrophizing, or obsessive thinking. And then you have behavioral symptoms, avoiding situations that may make a person feel anxious, and then this can impact on their study, work, and on their social life. So these are just a number of symptoms that a person could experience. They're not designed to provide a diagnosis. Of course, to have a diagnosis, someone needs to see a doctor, but the above can be used as a guide. Types of anxiety, GAD, so generalized anxiety disorder. This means that a person feels anxious on most days, worrying about lots of different things for a period of six months or more. Social anxiety, this means that a person has intense fear of being criticized, embarrassed, or humiliated, even in everyday situations. For example, going to a shopping center, eating publicly, being assertive at work, even just having a discussion at work. Panic disorder, so a person has panic attacks which are intense, they're overwhelming, and many times these are uncontrollable. And there's a lot of feelings of anxiety, and the physical symptoms are quite heightened for people with panic attacks as well. Someone having a panic attack would experience shortness of breath, chest pain, dizziness, excessive perspiration, so a lot of sweating. And sometimes people experiencing a panic attack think that they're having a heart attack or that they're about to die. So it's a very serious experience. It's happening psychologically, but really affecting the person physically as well. So some other conditions where anxiety could be present, you would have heard of OCD. You know, if someone just is likes to wash their hands a lot, we say other person's got OCD, for example. So this is when a person has ongoing, unwanted, intrusive thoughts and fears that cause anxiety. So the person could actually acknowledge these thoughts as being silly, and they try to relieve their anxiety by carrying out certain behaviors or rituals. For example, a fear of germs and contamination can lead to a person constantly washing their hands. And there's been examples of people that wash their hands so much that their hands go pink and sometimes bleed from this excessive sort of fear of germs and so on. Some of you might have heard of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So this generally happens when someone's experienced a traumatic event, for example, being in a war, experiencing an assault or witnessing an assault, an accident or disaster. Symptoms can include difficulty relaxing, upsetting dreams or flashbacks of the event, and avoidance of anything that triggers a memory of this event or brings them back to this memory, this experience. It's diagnosed when a person has symptoms for at least a month. And a few other mental illnesses that you might have heard of before. Bipolar disorder. So this is when a person has episodes of mood swings from depressive lows to manic highs. So they go from being really, really depressed to being in a state of manic where they just feel like they can conquer the world. So these really extreme mood swings. They can have symptoms such as high energy, reduced need for sleep, and loss of touch with reality. Depressive episodes could include symptoms such as low energy, low motivation, loss of interest in daily activities. Mood episodes last days to months at a time and may also be associated with suicidal thoughts. Treatment for bipolar disorder is usually lifelong, generally involves medication and psychotherapy, so a combination of medication and psychotherapy. ADHD, so attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It's a chronic condition including attention difficulty, hyperactivity, and impulsiveness. So ADHD often begins in childhood and can persist into adulthood. It contributes to low self-esteem, troubled relationships, and difficulty at school or work. Symptoms include limited attention and hyperactivity. Treatments include medication and talk therapy. And schizophrenia, it's a disorder that affects a person's ability to think, feel, and behave clearly. It's characterized by thoughts or experiences that seem out of touch with reality. So they may experience life on a different plane from what we're seeing that isn't real, but for them it's very real. It's a reality that is out of reality, if that makes sense. It can manifest itself with disorganized speech or behavior, decreased participation in daily activities, difficulty with concentration and memory, Difficulty with concentration and memory may also be present. And again, treatment for schizophrenia is usually lifelong and often involves combination of medication, psychotherapy, and coordinated specialty care services. So not just psychological treatment and medication, but other services wrapping around the individual to help them get through life as best as they can. So now we're going to look at a case study of John and Mina. Now forgive me, this is going to be quite small because I wanted to fit it all on the screen. There's no way you can read that, so I'll read it out to you. So John grew up in the Coptic church from a young age, along with 3 siblings. His father was an active deacon at church, and his mother would help at the church canteen when her health allowed it. His family home was not ideal. John's youngest memories involve him and his siblings hiding in their rooms while his father yelled at his mother at the top of his lungs, while the mother cowered in fear. This was a regular occurrence. As a result, John's mother had severe anxiety and depression. This resulted in her not being able to provide adequate emotional support and care to her children. John's mother would distance herself from the family and stay in her own room for most evenings of the week to try and alleviate her anxiety and depression. John's father was also very tough on John and his siblings. He had very high expectations but minimal fatherly love. If the children's marks were anything short of 90%, he would get quite upset and tell them they'd be useless in life and never amount to anything. The family home lacked familial intimacy, and thus their children each developed their own ways of coping with the stresses of life. Thankfully, John stayed close to the church and had a very supportive confession father whom he'd see once a fortnight. Around this visit with his confession father, John felt alone and struggled with his own emotions. John also struggled developing friendships at church as he had very poor social skills. Having said that, John read his Bible daily and also had a prayer rule that he followed with the advice of his spiritual father. He'd also attend the liturgy twice a week, weekly youth meetings, and served at the church bookstore after Sunday school. As John started year 12, he started to develop severe anxiety. He couldn't eat or sleep for days on end and started to experience severe bouts of depression. These would last for several days at a time. He prayed more, attended church more, spoke to his confession father, but his symptoms did not alleviate. He told an older servant from church that he was feeling really down and was having anxiety. The servant told him to fast and to pray to St. Mary and she would help him. John did this, but his symptoms continued to get worse. We'll now look at someone called Mina, so 18 years old, like John. So Mina grew up in an ideal family home. His parents loved each other and genuinely cared for their children. They also loved the church and were regularly attending church events and services. His home was generally filled with warmth, empathy, kindness, and love between all family members. On the weekends, the family would do fun and meaningful activities around their attendance at church. Mina attended the same church as John, had the same spiritual father, whom he'd also see once a fortnight, and had the exact same spiritual canon of prayer and Bible reading as John. Mina did really well in year 12 and approached his HSC with confidence, at peace, and believing he would achieve his desired ATAR result. Mina was also confident, caring, and had great relationships with his friends at church. Let's compare the two. So here we see 2 individuals who grew up in the same church, the same spiritual father, both committed to their spiritual life, yet poor John, through no fault of his own, had a terrible family home that affected him mentally and emotionally. Here we see a perfect example that living a rigid spiritual life is not always enough in cases where someone has experienced a variety of traumas in their life. Yes, thankfully John was close to the church and this definitely assisted him, 100%. Imagine someone called Craig, same family environment as John, but without church. The results could be far more horrific, such as turning to substance use as a coping mechanism to deal with the anxiety and depression, or even suicide. So we see the need here for John to have other treatment alongside his spiritual life to help him deal with his emotions and past traumas. So I'll put a question to you guys out there now. What are some ways that you could support John? And please wait for the microphone, so if you can put your hand up, that'd be great. What are some ways that you could support John?
I think, first of all, because like, I feel like me personally, I've been in that position sometimes. Like, I'd be like, I'd feel upset for some reason. Like, I just don't know why. But I think one of the ways how, like, it helped me was like, you know, there were people around me that were always caring. So I think the number one best thing to do is to always be supportive of that person. Always ask about him, hang around him and stuff like that. Make him feel welcomed and stuff like that with the group of friends. And then as well, like, I would 100% encourage him to speak to Abuna, because Abuna has so much advice. Like, he knows, like, either way, most priests, you know, have graduated from university as a doctor and stuff like that. So they have this kind of expertise and stuff like that to be able to give to John, maybe.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you, Daniel. Very good. So some very good points there, you know. Obviously, I'm sure that all of you would do this, but not isolating someone because they might be struggling with a mental illness. If anything, yes, a person might need their space, especially if they've got anxiety. They might have difficulty connecting with others. But a phone call, how are you, how you going, inviting that person out, trying to spend time with them is extremely helpful. And of course, speaking to our spiritual father. Yes, definitely. Anyone else? Anyone have any other ideas they could support John?
Yeah, I guess just reaching out to them. You probably know that someone like that sometimes doesn't have that, might not have that many people actually messaging them personally. So I think every now and then just kind of check in, see where they're at, get them to speak up as well, get them to talk about it. Like, I think your time is probably the most valuable thing to them. You're not going to really gain anything from it, but that's the beauty of it, is that you actually will. You probably will. You're going to gain the fact that you're going to know that someone's going to be happy just talking about what their problems are. So I think giving your time and just getting someone to talk about what their problems are is the most valuable thing. And yeah, helping them recognize what they can do to kind of move forward, because sometimes they might not recognize what the issue is, even though they're in it. But yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Very good. So again, the concept of reaching out, spending time, listening, listening to someone, very, very, very helpful, definitely. Anyone else? Anyone have any other ideas that might not have been raised? Right at the back.
So I think the main difference to me between the two people, you can hear me, right? Yeah, cool. I think the upbringing part where, I don't remember who, but the guy who had the worst upbringing. Hello? Okay. Yeah, I think the guy who I think quite earlier. Pretty much to challenge his thoughts a bit, to help him see more value in himself. So what his mindset about himself is, and like exercises, like things that help him feel good and motivate him to do better.
Fantastic. So again, the concept of love, care, support, and adding to that, challenging maybe some irrational thoughts that he might be having that are affecting his self-worth, and trying to help him see the positive in himself, build that self-esteem. And yeah, exercise, of course, is fantastic. So thanks, guys. Some really good answers. So you would have said a few of these things. So what are some ways you could help support John? Number one, be willing and open to talk about mental health. there's a lot of stigma, and it's really hard for someone when they've got depression or when they've got anxiety to feel comfortable to mention that, especially in a community setting, or to people that they might have friends, for example, in your social group or whatever, for fear of judgment. You know, being the strange bloke with anxiety or depression or whatever it might be. When we looked at the statistics, it's actually far more prevalent than what we think. So how many people would be in this room at any one time? Start counting, David, how many there are. Count how many there are here. So we saw that 20%, generally speaking, of Australian population has a mental health issue at any given time. So if in here, if we've got, let's see how many we've got approximately. 32 on this side, and let's say about 20 on that side, so 50. So, you know, that's like 10 people in here, 10 to 15 people that would have severe mental health in here based on those statistics. That's concerning, especially if everyone in here thinks that everyone else is fantastic and doing well. And that's where it's important to be willing and open to talk about mental health, to try and reduce that stigma. And I think we're heading in the right direction. I think in our parents' generations, there's a lot more stigma. It's like, suck it up. What do you mean you're anxious? Get over it. You know, what do you mean you're depressed? Get up, go to school. You know, like, they don't quite understand the concept, whereas I think it's starting to change now with the younger people. As some of you said, so ask Johnny if he wants to chat about why he's been feeling anxious and depressed. So it's important to understand what's happening in his life to then understand the next steps that we need to take in supporting John. Number 3, which links in again with number 1, listen with unconditional love. No judgment, just be present and listen. Many times, and I think men, we sort of struggle with this a lot more, we think that if someone starts talking to us about their problem, that we have to fix it. Women are much better at this. They don't try and give solutions. They just listen to each other. You'll notice if you're in well, you're too young, but Abuna will understand this one. But where it's a relationship and a wife might be talking about her problems to her husband, and her husband's thinking in his head, I'm going to fix it, I'm going to give this solution and that. And she's like, just be quiet and listen. I don't want a solution, I just want you to listen. So the power of listening with unconditional love, without judgment, is extremely powerful. And like the gentleman there said, many times you might be the only person that is giving that person the space to talk in that way, apart from, of course, their spiritual father. So listening with unconditional love is so important. Ask whether the person has spoken to their GP. You know, we're very blessed in Australia to have a lot of different services that can help. For example, so GP is a doctor. They can provide a mental health care plan which allows for 10 subsidized visits to a psychologist. So if someone has anxiety or depression and they talk to their GP and say, look, I'm really struggling with this, they can get a plan that allows for subsidized visits to a psychologist. And if you don't know, psychologist visits are quite expensive. So to be able to have that subsidized by the government is very helpful and can encourage people that might not be, you know, very well off to access treatment and to realize that even if I don't have $150 per visit for my psychologist, there's other cheaper options available. So encouraging someone to speak to their GP. The GP can also refer on to a dietitian. So diet links in with good mental health, as does exercise, which we mentioned a bit earlier. Number 5, ask whether John has actually seen a counselor or a psychologist to work through his issue. Professionals can help him work through the trauma he's experienced and develop strategies and techniques to deal with his emotions. Number 6, which links on to that, is referring on to culturally appropriate Christian therapists. It makes the world of difference if someone is speaking to a Christian counselor or a Christian psychologist, especially if you can find someone from the community that's Coptic. You know, going into a secular psychologist who might be an atheist, they still will have amazing skills and techniques and be able to help to a certain point. But when that psychologist also has a similar faith in you, it allows them to be able to help you in certain ways that the other person might not. What it can also do is allow for communication, if John gives a permission, between the priest and the psychologist to have wraparound care for John. So holistic treatment, having many people working together to support him in overcoming his issues. Number 7, don't be against medication. You know, so we need to be able to support medication where necessary. If a person has severe diabetes, we're not going to tell them to fight it naturally. Some people might, but it's a bit dangerous to do so. There's medication for that, and of course, natural changes to diet and so on will help. But you need to medicate if someone's got bad diabetes. So in the same way, if someone's got severe mental health issues, we shouldn't be against medication alongside the psychological treatment, because both can work together, and hopefully after the person is receiving adequate care, support, services, then the medication can be tapered off and the person can get back to normal. But in extreme cases, especially with severe anxiety or depression, medication could be a lifesaver for these people. Because their mood is so low, or their anxiety is so severe, without that medication they could be at higher risk of suicide. So the medication will bring some sort of balance. Medication alone, I don't like medication by itself, because you're not then treating the underlying causes or issues. But medication with seeing a therapist, psychologist, counselor, whatever, is always very helpful. So we should never be against that. Number 8, be available to listen and follow up with John. So it's not enough to just call him once and say, hey, how you going, how you been, and so on, and then you forget about him for 3 months. We need to put in the time and effort to continue to reach out to a person in a non-judgmental way with a lot of love, so that John has more supports, more protective factors around him to help him go forward and find healing. And where possible, always encourage a holistic approach. So try and get as many supports together and working together. So for example, you could have a Buna working together with a therapist, the GP, and the family, all working together to assist John. That way, all his needs are being met as a human being, spiritual, physical, psychological, the whole lot. Everyone's doing their part to help him go forward. The more support an individual receives, the better chances they have of overcoming their issues and working towards recovery. Sometimes an abuna is not enough. And this is another area where sometimes in our community we can look at abuna like a superhuman, like God. Yeah? And we have to remember that there are other services and supports that even abuna himself will utilize to help people. The role of abuna is to assist someone in their journey to union with God, to knowing and loving Christ and becoming like Christ. They're not social workers, they're not psychiatrists, or some might be, like you said. Daniel's not here, but some might have studied in the past, and that's fantastic, because then they have those skills and talents to draw from. But not all of them are going to be psychiatrists, psychologists, counselors, dietitians, personal trainers. So all these various fields of practice have their own specialists. And a good spiritual father will always know their role and when and where they can refer appropriately to other services, so that they can all again work together in supporting the person who's unwell. And again, remembering that if they work together, it's a better outcome for John than each person doing their thing and not knowing what everyone else is doing. So coming together in that support is fantastic. Self-care. So anyone who's in a helping profession, whether you're a servant at Sunday school, obviously even more so if you're a servant in Sunday school, you need to be taking care of your own spiritual life. If you're not taking time out, as our Lord Jesus did, he'd take time out, go on the mountain away from the people and spend time in prayer with his Heavenly Father. In the same way, we ourselves need to take time out from our service to connect with God and also take care of ourselves in this way. So having a balanced life with dedicated time to prayer, to fasting, to scriptural reading, to spiritual reading, to exercise, all of this contributes to us being well enough to be able to support and help other people. And this is even more so, especially for our beloved abunas, because their life is so hard, so they need to have that time. But the same applies for counselors, psychologists, social workers. For those who might be studying in any of those fields, you'll find that the rates of burnout are far higher than other professions. So you're not going to see much burnout working in the banking industry. You'll see a lot of burnout in community services, because you're dealing with broken people, which means you're dealing with people's pain and suffering, and to help them many times you're entering into that pain, entering into that suffering, which requires us firstly to be filled with Christ so that we have the strength and ability to constantly be seeing these difficulties and getting away from this at times so that we can care for ourselves. So please prioritize self-care as well. And as I said at the beginning, there's probably a lot of things that I didn't cover in this talk. Perhaps you want a little bit more of a spiritual perspective on this. Any other areas you feel I didn't cover, please ask questions, and I'm more than happy to run through those with you now. Yeah, so look, psychologists or counselors have pretty much studied the human psyche. So, what's happening in the person's mind that's leading to them, for example, having depression. So, I'll give you one example of a therapy that could be used by a counselor or a psychologist. So, has anyone heard of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy? So, cognitive behavioral therapy works under the premise that when someone experiences a particular situation, that situation will be interpreted by that person a certain way, and they'll have certain thoughts on that situation. And then those thoughts themselves, if they're healthy and rational, will result in healthy emotions and healthy behavior. And I'll give you an example. If the thoughts are irrational, they're going to result in turmoil of emotions, so negative emotions and then negative behavior. So I'm going to give you an example. So someone like John, who's got really low self-esteem, depression, anxiety, might be walking past a friend, and the friend doesn't greet John, doesn't look up and doesn't greet him. And John thinks, oh my gosh, I've done something to upset him. This person's, just ignored me. And John gets even more upset, goes within himself and walks away. So what's happened there is he has interpreted that situation as my friend doesn't want to talk to me. There's no evidence there that that's actually the case. Someone else who doesn't have anxiety and depression and has higher levels of self-esteem will go through the same experience and think, oh, my mate didn't see me. Oi, how are you? How you going? And avoids all those negative emotions and then the behavior of putting their head down and walking away. So what you'll find is a lot of people that have mental health issues have negative core beliefs about themselves, about the world, that manifest themselves in these negative and irrational thoughts. And many times they don't even realize these thoughts. They become automatic. So the role of a counselor or psychologist in that situation would be helping the person identify these irrational thoughts, helping them replace those irrational thoughts with more realistic thoughts, which then will result in more positive emotions and more positive behaviors. And that's like a really basic example, but people with severe mental health have a lot of negative thoughts like that about themselves, about the world, and it's changing those core beliefs entirely so that they see the world in a better way. Now, some people think, well, what's the point of that? Why doesn't the person just get close to God? Now, God in His love and grace will obviously help a person immensely when they turn to Him. So the more a person has a spiritual life, loves God, is united to Him, repents, confesses, comes to church, obviously they're bathing in the presence of God, which is contributing to their healing. But a lot of those traumas, because they're so deep, a person needs a little bit of extra help from someone like a Christian counselor or psychologist to get through that quicker, compared to many years of slowly being healed through the grace of God. I'll disclose, so in my early 20s, I had severe anxiety. Thank God, by the grace of God, that left. But I came to Christ in my early 20s when I was 21, and for maybe 5-6 years after that, I had severe anxiety. Very, very bad. Not wanting to eat, difficulty sleeping, and so on. But I was at church regularly. I had a proper spiritual life, praying daily, reading the Bible, spiritual books, abstaining a lot from sin, confessing regularly. Yet I still had these issues from past traumas and so on. So having the Christian life plus a counselor at that stage allowed me to work through that stuff and get to the point where, through God's grace, I found healing. So if I didn't see a counselor, then yeah, fantastic. I'm still going to church and benefiting from that 100%. And that's a protective factor. The whole idea, though, is that a counselor or a psychologist has the ability to allow a person to question themselves and see themselves clearer and overcome a lot of those negative and distorted cognitions about themselves and the world and so on. That's where a psychologist or a counselor can really work wonders, especially, again, and I mentioned that, a Christian counselor or psychologist, so at least they can work closely with the Bona and help a person work through the issues. Anyone else? Yes, Daniel.
How would you be able to help a person, like, say, your friend or something like that you feel like he has some sort of depression or anxiety, and maybe the person may not know of it, but you kind of have a sense that they do have this type of mental illness, especially with the way how maybe other people may treat him, or the way how he interacts with other people? how would you be able to help them?
Look, it's a difficult question. Obviously through prayer. So, one of the most basic things that I say to anyone is before you approach someone to help them, please take that to prayer, so that God allows you the grace and the wisdom to know how to deal with that person and gives you the love to be able to help them in that way. Secondly, through your relationship with that person, hopefully it's a close relationship, you know them well. Sometimes it's just a matter of asking, like, how are you going? Are you feeling okay? I noticed, for example, if you notice something in particular, I noticed that you were really down during the meeting. That might be an entry point for that person to open up. If they don't open up, don't force it. They may not be ready to talk, but I think that by being close to people and having a relationship with them, hopefully when times do get tough and you do notice a difference with them and you mention that, they might be willing to open up. If someone's not willing to open up, there's not really much that we can do apart from pray for that person, maybe speak to their spiritual father and say, look, I've noticed that this person's not seeming like themselves. Maybe they'll feel more comfortable speaking to Abuna. Yeah, if someone's not ready yet, there isn't really much that we can do. When someone comes to realize they have a problem, there's a lot of help that can be provided. Yeah. Anyone else? Yep.
With the whole stigma of like the older generation thinking that like these things don't exist or etc. etc.
Yep.
Like, what is the best approach to that? Like, let's say you know an older person who has that kind of opinion or that perspective. What is the best thing you can do to, I guess, enlighten them that this is something real, this is something that requires treatment, just like any other kind of disorder? And my second part of my question is, like, is there anything in the Bible that directly suggests that?
Directly suggests?
Yeah, like directly like shows that it's okay to be treated in this way.
Okay. So to answer your first question, with the older community and some of our parents, grandparents, and so on, it wasn't really spoken about. So if you look at when they were growing up, when they were going through school, this wasn't something that was spoken about. So it was perceived as a weakness if someone said, I've got anxiety or depression. And that's why for them it's like, this stuff is rubbish, I don't believe in it. Sometimes having someone whom they respect and look up to, speak to them might be helpful. So that could be like their spiritual father, a priest, their GP. So someone that they look up to. Generally our older sort of community loves doctors, they're very special. So encouraging them to speak to their GP about this and say, all right, does this thing exist? Organising talks like this where we have statistics, we can actually show them that this is a real thing, this is a condition that exists, there is treatment for it. But yeah, I think with the older community, having people that, sometimes they won't listen to a young person, they won't listen to you if it's your grandparents. But if Abuna says, look, this is something real, there's a thing called depression, this is what it's like, anxiety and so on. So it's all about, I think, education and coming from the right person that they'll respect and listen to. So when we talk about whether the scriptures actually talk about anything that shows that it's okay to get treatment for this sort of stuff, in one of the Deuterocanonical books, someone might want to Google this because I don't know the exact reference, but it's in the Wisdom of Sirach. In the Wisdom of Sirach, doctors are praised. So someone that is a doctor is praised as someone who's got the grace and wisdom from God to be able to help and treat other people. So in the same way, a psychological illness, whether it's depression, anxiety, is the same as any sickness that you'll have on your body. If someone, for example, as I mentioned, diabetes or has cancer, we won't ever say why, you're not going to say, oh, does it say in the Bible that we can get treatment for cancer? No one's ever going to think that. Or does it say in the Bible that I can get treatment for an ulcer that I've got on my leg or for any sort of physical ailment? We'll never think that. We'll know that God wants us to take care of ourselves. God wants us to respect and value our bodies, that our bodies are tools in our spiritual life, to raise our hands in prayer, to serve and use our hands to give others, whatever it might be, they're a tool. So we take care of our body. In the same way, if we've got sickness of the soul, why would God not want us to receive treatment for that sickness so that we can become mentally and and physically well in all regards, holistically as a human being? I don't see any reason why not. And the Bible does talk about, our Lord said, be transformed by the renewing of the mind. So renewing of the mind is putting off the old man, putting off our desires and passions and sin, and putting on the new man to be conformed to Christ. What does that mean? having rational thoughts about the world and those around me, that I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. I don't have to be thinking that I'm useless and I'm a failure. That's not what the Bible teaches. So if a Christian counselor or psychologist can help someone overcome the thoughts of the old man and put on more realistic and true thoughts, and that's also renewing of the mind, as our Lord said. So I don't see any disagreement at all from a scriptural perspective. Yeah. Thank you.
It's the book of Sirach, chapter 38. It's just the first verse. It says, "Honor the physician with the honor due him, and also according to your need of him, for the Lord created him."
Yeah. So there we see a biblical reference for doctors, and all that a counselor or psychologist is a doctor of the mind. They help someone overcome negative beliefs, cognitions, work through past traumas to become healthy mentally and have a healthy mind. Yeah. Any other questions, guys? Or thoughts? No? All right, thank you all. Pleasure to be with you. If you do have any questions later, feel free to pass them to the servants, and happy to help out. Thank you.
We'd just like to thank Evan for those wonderful words. And the discussion at the end as well is always very enlightening, especially when we have someone who actively answers questions. It was really nice. Just a few announcements for tonight, guys. So I see social distancing didn't really go too well, but that's okay. We've got a few announcements. So save the date, 6th of December is Carols at the Point. There's a Facebook event. You can see Chris McGalley for more details to invite you personally to the event. Also, we've got next week on Wednesday, Origin Game 1, Wednesday the 4th. So we're going to be streaming that on the field. So anybody who'd like to come in and join, you're more than welcome. We'll have a great time together. The QR code is up there on the screen now. If anyone's walked in without scanning in for COVID, that'd be really appreciated. Also, Andrew's going to give some more details, but Southwest Soccer is on very soon on a Saturday. So it'd be really great. You could see Andrew.